So if we're ready, we'll start the recording now. So welcome everyone to our, just do this disclaimer. Welcome everyone to our first Telosa webinar. My name is John Mallon. I'm the CEO of the Telosa Community Foundation. And I just want to take a moment since we have Telosa community members across the US. We hope all of you are safe and well with the Hurricane Ian and the severe damage that we're seeing being inflicted in Florida. So again, hope everyone, their friends and family are okay. Our topic today is Equitism, creating a higher quality of life, which is timely and relevant for today and our future. This is the first in our webinar series. Our next topics will include sustainability and the environment, technology and innovation, diversity and inclusion, and much more. Let me just take another moment to thank those who have participated in our surveys, which are important as we use these to shape our strategy. And the initial survey results for Equitism have shown an overwhelming interest and support for Equitism as an economic model, and the idea of using funds generated from community assets to support and fund enhanced public services. So imagine a city where, as the city does better, all the residents do better. And we call this Equitism, which is really fundamental to the mission, vision, and values of Telosa. It's a vision and a mission and values where the mission is about creating a more equitable and sustainable future, a vision to create a blueprint that serves people today and in the future. And importantly, a core set of values shapes how we work together to create solutions. And Equitism, as you'll hear in, later, is really a key component to make it all happen. Now for the program, we're very excited to introduce our expert guest speakers that are with us today. We have Ben McAdams, former mayor, representative from Utah, and now with the Sorensen Impact Center, which is really leading an important initiative with 6 local governments to really put underutilized assets to work. And we're very proud to be a part in supporting this initiative, which you hear more about. And Josh Vincent, who's the executive director of the Center for the Study of Economics, both of whom bring very real-world experience impacting cities today and working to create a blueprint for the future as well. So finally, let me introduce and turn it over to Dr. Daniels, our Telosa community manager. Krista is director of the Resources Management and Administration degree at Antioch University. She specializes in land use and focuses on participatory community engagement strategies. And she's here to talk quickly about community engagement to co-create Telosa and the role Equitism will play. So Dr. Daniels, if I can turn it over to you.
Perfect, great, thanks. Thanks, John. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. Today, I'm just gonna quickly talk to you and then we're gonna get on to our wonderful speakers. My work for Telosa really focuses on how we can design a city that is co-created by people. And that's based on honest engagement, empowerment of community members, and a commitment to the common good by focusing on our shared values, the values that John has talked about, which are open, fair, and inclusive. So how do we do this? How do we start building the Telosa community? Well, the first step, as many of you know, is to join us on Mighty Networks. And so this is where we're asking you to ask your friends, your family, and others to be part of the discussions on Telosa. We're just starting out, but this is a great place where you can engage, share your thoughts, and learn with others. We're also going to be having more webinars like this one tonight on various different topics from the different topic groups on the Mighty Networks platform. And these webinars are places where we're going to gather your feedback and we can answer some questions. The next step, though, to these introductory webinars will follow up with virtual convenings in 2023. And that's where we're going to hope hopefully start rolling up our sleeves and talk about best practices and these best practices, how we can help envision and implement these in the city of Telosa. It'll be a place where we deconstruct barriers we may be up against, because there's lots of barriers. But we know we can achieve our vision if we're working together and thinking about how we can get over those barriers. Next slide. So I would like to introduce you to Tom Rossman. He's a historian and thought leader, a senior advisor to the Telosa Community Foundation. He's also on the board of the Henry George School of Social Science. Tom has spent his career studying how social, political, and economic systems generate prosperous societies and cohesive communities around the world. He's been a featured speaker in conferences in over 22 countries. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tom so he can kick off the topic of equitism.
Thank you so much, Krista. We're very excited tonight to talk about equitism, and how we can really create a higher quality of life. As you can see, basically put, equitism is inclusive growth. And I think it's important to kind of look at the origin story. So when we started creating this new city idea of Telosa, we thought it made a lot of sense to also include a new economic model for society as well. And so it all begins with Telosa. The name Telosa, as some of you may know, comes from the Greek word that means ultimate aim or highest purpose. And for the Greeks, the highest purpose of a city was to have a place that created the conditions for individuals to succeed and the overall society to flourish as well. So they felt if you had one without the other, you weren't achieving your highest purpose and your ultimate aim. And so that's our goal with Telosa, is to create a more sustainable and equitable future. And equitism is sort of the engine driving the economic model that we're going to be using. So with equitism, we are featuring and focusing on growth and opportunity that are both inextricably linked. And so in creating that inclusive growth will be the ultimate result of that. As we move on, thank you. So what is equitism? So equitism is a new economic model based on the premise of land value return. And a principal aspect of every city is the land. And it's often ignored by economics, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But in many cities, it is really a key driver of growth, and at the core of a lot of what the city does and how the city grows and thrives. At the same time, if not done properly, it can also drive exclusion and inequality. So how this works, how equitism works, is the land in the city is owned by the community foundation. And as the land prices appreciate as the city grows, that appreciation is reinvested back into the community to fund enhanced social services. And those services are, as you can see on the right, are what we call the building blocks of prosperity. And we'll get into that a little bit more as well as we move to the next slide. As we move on, so imagine living in a city where as the city does better, the citizens do better. That's the basic premise of equitism. And an example of how that works, education, as many of you know, education is a huge source of inequality in many countries. And at the same time, having education in an information economy is essential to the success of every young person. So in Telosa, through equitism, we're going to ensure that every child receives a world-class education. And also part of that will be the training, both in terms of apprenticeships, vocational training, and mentorships that'll be part of preparing and essential in preparing students for the jobs of today and the jobs of tomorrow, which are so essential to their individual success. And as we move to the next slide, so what will equitism mean for you? So it's interesting because when we first started looking at cities and comparing, we've done extensive research and talked to some of the leading experts in the world. It sort of reminds me of that old Tolstoy quote that, all happy families are alike, but every unhappy family is unhappy in its own unique way. Well, what we found is the same thing for cities, is that all the successful cities that we studied had a few characteristics in common. And of course, every failed city had sort of its own unique story. So what we have done is put together the 4 main essential building blocks of prosperity. The first being housing. Every successful city had clean, safe, comfortable housing for everyone. They provided jobs and retraining so that people were able to realize their potential and have personal and professional growth. They had world-class education for the children, pre-K through higher education and advanced education. And they focused on health and wellness, not just the healthcare system itself and providing things like local clinics, but also in things such as making it a walkable city and making the city a healthy environment where it's free of pollution, as well as having the ability to walk and be active in parks and green space to recreate as well, and convenient to where they live. Next slide, please. As we move on, so here's what we get when we put all these things together. We get inclusive growth and unlimited opportunity. And as you can see, the graph, the top 20% will continue to do well. But the significant impact of Equitism is going to be bringing the growth of the bottom 80% considerably higher. For the past 45 years, we've had a very stagnant trajectory for middle income and working class individuals in the United States. And what we're going to do through Equitism is imbue people with the tools to substantially change their own personal trajectory and put them on a permanent path of growth that will not only make a huge difference in their lives, but will also in turn build the community and help it grow and expand as well. And as we're moving on, so land, why is land so important? This is an essential part of Equitism. So I think it's important to really get a little deeper on this and understand exactly why land plays such an important role, especially in cities. So poor land policies have vital resources that leave the community. And without reinvesting those resources, communities can often become very stagnant. It also leads to erratic development such as sprawl, blight, congestion, and vacant lots. Just a personal anecdote, I was having dinner at 6th Avenue and 57th Street, one of the highest end areas of Manhattan. And right across the street was the beautiful Grace Building. Down the block was Carnegie Hall. And right in front of us was a giant vacant lot. And so that type of erratic development, it's obviously an eyesore, but it also removes and reduces the quality of life of the citizens who live there. So the end result of these poor land policies is slower economic growth, higher inequality, and as I mentioned, this sort of vicious cycle of stagnation. And as you can see in the picture, this is actually an example of the before and after in terms of reinvestment versus money leaving the city or the system. Next, as we move on. So this is the positive part. So the ultimate goal of Equitism is to create the virtuous cycle. So as we eliminate the unearned income and free riding that takes money out of communities, we reinvest it so that the taxpayer generated gains are going back into the community, more development, more jobs, more excitement, and it goes back into higher economic growth, and the cycle repeats itself. So it grows and builds on itself. And I think all of us have kind of gone to cities where there was just a level of excitement and a level of energy that was very different than other places we visited. So it's a palpable sense once you see this virtuous cycle in action. And there's many examples around the world that show the power of these positive land policies. As we move on, then so land value return. So as we mentioned earlier, Equitism is based on the concept of land value return, and it's sort of an unfamiliar topic because for the last 150 years, land has really been largely ignored by the economic community. And we feel that that's a big mistake. And by changing that and helping to be part of Equitism and building this community, we hope to change that conversation as well. But essentially what land value return is the appreciation of the land as a byproduct of a growing community, because the more people that move in, the more services, the more taxes that grow, that go into building all the services and infrastructure, gets reinvested back into the community, into the local area. And what this creates is as our values of fairness and inclusion are part of the process, the value that the community creates should be reinvested. We feel that's fair, it's inclusive, and not just captured by a few people who benefit from the value that's being created by the community. And it's fairly empirically clear that land is a very major component of both local and national economies. So including that and making this correction through Equitism is a very powerful force. Moving on then to the next slide, we'll talk about what does land value return mean for you? So as you can see, land ownership and the profit from the appreciation in Telosa goes back to the foundation, as opposed to individuals who would tend to take that money out of the community. If you want to rent an apartment, it's basically the same. You sign a lease with the landlord, and that's how it works. Purchasing, again, very similar. The only real difference is you don't own the property underneath, but in most cities, people don't own the property underneath the residences that they live in. The residential purchase price will tend to be less costly because you're not paying for the land. And then, of course, taxes will be, instead of a full property tax, there will be a split between a lower property tax and a land rent that will go to the foundation. So moving on. Here I think is really a great way to understand this and kind of put it into context. So the land value impact in terms of the community expenditures and the community investment is clearly illustrated by a couple of great examples. So Congress convened a study on Washington, D.C. and the subway project there. They spent $4 billion, the federal government and the District of Columbia spent $4 billion expanding the DC subway. The study concluded that it had driven $2 billion in increased land prices for individuals in the DC area. So the taxpayers of the District of Columbia and the US paid $4 billion to drive $2 billion of private gain for individuals. And that money obviously left the community and did not go back into reinvesting into the enhanced social services. The Jubilee Line extension in London is an even more egregious example. They spent £3.5 billion to build the Jubilee Line in the 1990s and early 2000s. And several studies by the government and other outside consultants showed that it drove between 12 and 13 billion pounds in increased land value for individuals. In fact, one property owner in London wrote a book. His name is Don Riley, and he wrote a book that he made more money on the Jubilee Line extension than all of the taxes that he had paid for his entire life combined. So it's a powerful force that not using the land properly means that the taxpayer money is going out of the community and not being reinvested. The Big Dig in Boston is another great example. The elevated highway that Big Dig replaced was torn down and turned into a park. And immediately all of the landowners around that park who had owned old and dilapidated buildings and people who were getting tax breaks for depreciation suddenly had a giant windfall purely on the back of billions of dollars of public expenditure. So not to dwell on the negative, there are lots of success stories, and Josh will get into this more in a little bit, but Harrisburg, Pennsylvania was voted in the 70s as being one of the worst mid-sized cities in the US, and it adopted land value return policies, and it was able to turn around and be voted as one of the top 5 mid-sized cities in the US. As you can see in the bottom of your screen, the community land trusts, they dot throughout the US, and it's another way for people to capture that increasing land value from the community and reinvest it back into the community. It's also very popular, by the way, in Europe. Excuse me, England and Northwestern Europe are very active in having community land trusts to help keep that value in the community. And then one of the biggest examples that we have is Singapore, where in the mid-60s, Singapore was actually kicked out of the British Empire and the Malaysian country. Nobody wanted them. And because of intelligent land policies and good governance, they were able to turn themselves into one of the greatest economic miracles of the late 20th century and have been very prosperous. The government in Singapore owns 90% of the land, and they have 91% home ownership. And for those of you who are thinking, gosh, if I don't own the land in a city with the residents, I will be missing out on appreciation. The people in Singapore who own residences there have done extremely well. And it's all because of the success of the community. So creating that virtuous cycle and bringing that money, keeping that money in the community and spending it to build human capital is a way to really dynamically increase both the prosperity of individuals and the success and growth and cohesion of the community. As we move on then. So Equitism is really the driving force of Telosa. As the community grows and expands, the resources of the foundation will expand and create that virtuous cycle. Telosa, using the power of Equitism, will be a place where both the individual and the community can reach their full potential, truly flourishing, thriving together. Everyone has a stake and no one is left behind. And so that's what we're trying to create. And as we move then to the next portion of our process, we're going to have a panel discussion. So allow me to, and we're really privileged because we have two rock stars in terms of community engagement and building resources to reinvest back into the community. So I'll turn it over to Ben, and then we'll have a presentation by Josh after that.
Well, thanks, Tom. Thanks, John. Great to be with you all. I am, what I love about the work that Telosa is doing. So I'm a former mayor, Salt Lake County mayor, so county executive, but here in Utah, and then was later elected to the United States Congress. But what I like about this Telosa approach is with Telosa looking at what they can do with kind of a blank slate, and cities and learning from cities, what's gone well and what hasn't gone well in cities over the course of history. And they're learning so much, and it's so exciting to see what they're working to apply. But at the same time, cities are also learning from Telosa. And so there's just an open body of knowledge and sharing as we work to improve cities that we all live in currently, how to take what's happening with Telosa and import it back into our cities to make our communities a better place to live. So I wanted to talk about some work that I'm doing that started when I was mayor and continues now with to invest in America's communities by putting government assets to work, some of what Tom talked about. So let's go to the next slide. So millions of people around the world have discovered how to make money right in their backyard or in their own homes from resources that they own. They rent out a spare bedroom, for example, and earn spare cash that helps to pay for groceries, gas, or any other number of needs, as we see with some of these share economy here. In fact, if you go to the next slide, my daughter, that's her right there. Oh, back up. That's my daughter right there. She just turned 16. She got a car, and she found that there was an app where she could rent out her car to make money when she's not using it. So of course, as a father of a new driver, I was enthusiastically on board with that, because every time she rented out her car, it meant it was a day that she was not on the road. So, but she's doing that to save up money and help to save up for school. So, how people across this country, across the globe are really looking at their own personal assets and using those assets to generate revenue. Meanwhile, most local governments in the US have at their fingertips a wealth of real estate assets that are underutilized. Dormant parking lots like this one, empty plots of land, vacant buildings in quiet parts of town, and so much more. So what could happen if government made better use of those assets? What if government could generate revenue from those assets without losing ownership and without raising taxes? And they could use that new money earned without raising taxes on a single person and return it to the community in the form of benefits, as we have been discussing today. So here is what happened when I was mayor of Salt Lake County. We embarked to do an inventory of all publicly owned assets. We excluded assets that had no commercial value. So we have, one of the things we have here is backcountry ski terrain that is precious to all of us, and we never want to develop that. We want to keep it in a natural state. But we looked at viable public spaces. We found that we have 44 square miles of viable publicly owned property in the Salt Lake Valley. Should go to the next slide. So if, just to take an example of this. So what you're seeing right here, this is West High School. My twins, my daughter and her twin brother that you saw in the earlier slide, have attended West High School. It's a Title I school in the heart of downtown Salt Lake City, not far from the Mormon temple that you see on the bottom right of the screen, and there's West High School right there. It is 1,500 feet from a transit station and across the street from a multifamily infill that's valued at $16 million per acre. And yet you see there on the upper left, the high school is highlighted. So if we go to the next slide, you can see that $16 million per acre multifamily infill there. The next slide is you see an opportunity. So that is their driver's education course. That is a parking lot that's used sometimes, but mostly used for an hour a day in the early mornings for driver's education. I will note that there's a driver's education course at the Utah Department of Motor Vehicles less than a couple miles away that they could also use. So if we go to the next, that's an opportunity. You see an opportunity over here of underutilized land where the city has densified around it. You see an opportunity across the street with the football field and some things there. Now schools need open spaces, but if we took a step back and looked at this in a new way, let's advance to the next one. We could create, if we used our property differently, $406 million off of just re-envisioning how we use the high school land. Next slide. So this is that driver's education course. If you go to the next one, approximately 224 parking spaces. Just that alone, if we used it like the multifamily across the street, could generate $29 million. So think about what that could do if the high school told our drivers who are learning to drive that they wanted them to go to the course that's 2 miles away. And we put in multifamily there, but the school district remained and retained an ownership interest in this and developed an annuity, a revenue source off of this. Imagine in this Title I school giving every student a contribution on an annual basis to a college savings plan, what that would do to their ability and desire to attend college and their belief in themselves that college was a possibility. You could do so much, you could do that and so much more. We just thought about how we use the land. Go to the next slide. So the opportunity cost, it is costing $128,000 per parking space to continue to use it as we're using it right now. Next slide. So I talked, and John mentioned that we, to try and figure out in our existing cities, to take what Telosa is talking about on a blank slate and apply it, reverse engineer it, and apply it back to our local cities. So I'm working with the Government Finance Officers Association, VFOA, and we've created the Putting Assets to Work incubator to work with, and we're working with these 6 jurisdictions here to inventory their land like we did in Salt Lake County when I was mayor, understand the depth of the assets that are owned and the possibility from that, and then to land on a structure where we could tap into these resources to create opportunity and prosperity for the residents of these communities. So look forward to continuing to collaborate with Telosa to learn more from you and also contribute our learning in cities across the country to what you're hoping to do in Telosa.
Fantastic. Thanks, Ben. So Josh, we also have the privilege of having Josh Vincent, who is really one of the leading experts in the United States on land value return. So I'll turn it over to him to discuss his experience and what he's done, both in terms of success in land value return, and then also in terms of what are the challenges that you see in getting land value return implemented in the US.
Hey, thanks very much, Tom. Can everybody hear me? Yes? Okay.
Yes, we can. Thanks, Josh.
Great. Okay. Yeah, I run a nonprofit foundation that's a 501c3. It's been around since 1926 in one form or another. And it was based in southwestern Pennsylvania. And it was founded by progressive politicians of the day. And they had to address, as all of us do, except in the case of Telosa, we have to deal with the tax system. And so the idea of a tax reform is really how this is used, when it's used around the world and in the United States. And I'm going to talk, I think, more about the pitfalls that are possible and maybe some ways to pull back from the brink. We work almost exclusively, or did work almost exclusively, with post-industrial small cities, struggling cities in Western Pennsylvania. You can think of the small towns that had 3 shifts and won World War II, like Aliquippa and Steelton and Duquesne, and Farrell, places like that. And after the smokestack industries left in the mid-1970s to the early 1980s, left due to foreign competition and by disinvestment by the plant owners, the steel factory owners. These businesses went under. The land ownership remained with the corporate owners, but the jobs left. And so many cities were stuck in Pennsylvania and elsewhere with this situation. And so the idea of going back to a rather old classical economics idea of gaining revenue to pay for the community through the land value that inherently existed, even in these disinvested cities and rather poor towns, there was land value. And that land value had to be mobilized and then deployed. And what we've done is change the tax structure. And I know that our goal is not to talk about taxes, but more like land value return. And that's a very hopeful, optimistic sign. The problem in these towns is who's going to oppose this? Well, think about the current tax system and why I think Telosa is aiming for a higher place to be, a place where everybody's valued. The problem is that we paid taxes now for 100 years, 150 years, and the people that run our communities, accepting Your Honor, of course, the people that run our communities do things the same way. And so if you can get $10 million from a tax on bubblegum machines and cigarette vending machines, then you keep that tax, no matter how obsolescent it is. And in these Pennsylvania towns, most of the taxes were taxing obsolete, almost horse-drawn carriage economy things. And what they weren't taxing was the inherent land value that was generated by the community and also generated by individuals working hard. And that system worked for a while. That's why you had in your steel towns the Carnegie Library and public assets that added value to the community. You had capitalists building their factories, and then you had labor being deployed through the hands of the workers. In 1979 or 80, that fell apart. And so we restructured the tax structures in these cities. And I'm going to just briefly name a few. Allentown, which was listed as the worst place to live by Fortune magazine in 1980. And some of you around my age might remember the song Allentown by Billy Joel as sort of an avatar of how far America had fallen. What they did is they changed their revenue system. And in Allentown, Duquesne, and Clairton, and Aliquippa, they brought in revenue, and they brought in the equal amount of revenue, if not more, by simply collecting the land value that existed in the city using assessed values, which is sometimes a very dicey prospect. And they reduced other taxes. And so I don't want to take up too much of our time on this, But Harrisburg, I think, is a pretty good example because, again, like Allentown, like a few others, they were bereft, nearly bankrupt. They were put on a par by HUD with East St. Louis. And I think a lot of us know the East St. Louis story. It was bad. So the city was broke. They had a hurricane. Things fell apart. But one of the mayors and then subsequent mayors realized that there was a source of revenue there that was like under our feet. And that's where the revenue is. And by untaxing those things, a lot of these towns were able to buy time and some to catapult themselves into success. Allentown used to be the 5th largest city in Pennsylvania. Now it's the 3rd largest. And that's because, one, growth in Allentown, but also, 2, continued decline in other large cities in Pennsylvania. Philadelphia lost 25% of its population from World War II until 2000. So the barriers are going to be habit and old practices. People say, why should we change? Things are fine. If they look at what the shift in revenues would be, they will always say, hey, my Uncle Charlie's going to pay more. Can't have that. And so you have this ingrained opposition, and it's a reactionary opposition. And it really, except for a few enlightened city leaders and community leaders, they don't look to the future. They look to just crouch and protect what they have, sort of like protecting the flame of a guttering candle. And so I think that in Pennsylvania, we showed that towns in trouble could turn themselves around, or at least buy time. And in the past 10 years, several states, Maryland, Virginia, Connecticut, and others changed laws to permit cities to dig into that land rent, to that economic rent that existed. You do need permissive legislation. We actually are doing a study for Salt Lake City now, so we'll see how that works out. But what I would leave you with, again, I don't want to take up a lot of your time, and going into questions would be great, is that if people drop their bad habits like smoking or whatever, if they drop bad habits when it comes to collecting revenue and you start looking at a new way, you're going to start to bring your people back into the fold of feeling included in the community. In Allentown, this program was voted in by the voters twice. The first time it won by a 2-to-1 margin, and then the opponent said, well, you know, voters, they're dumb. So the second time it went up for a vote, it passed by the same margin, 2-to-1 margin. So people understood in all the neighborhoods of Allentown, from working class to upper class, that the whole community benefited, and that it was easier, and this might sound crass, to make a buck in Allentown with a job or whatever, as opposed to being outside of Allentown. And be happy to answer any questions, but I'll be sending materials out. There have been a lot more studies by the Lincoln Institute and others that show that growth has occurred with land value return. And it was not an accident. It was an effort started in 1926. So thanks very much. And I'm going to kick it back to Tom.
Okay. John?
Yes. Okay. Why don't we shift gears then to the Q&A, and maybe just continue on, Josh, what you were talking about. And we often hear the same questions in the Telosa network. Why haven't these big ideas been adopted in U.S. cities more widely? And Josh, you were talking about, how important it is to overcome sort of ingrained opposition. And I wonder if I can maybe direct it over to Ben, just to maybe share your experience with the number of states that cities that you're currently working on, in your experience, in terms of how do we overcome the opposition so that we can implement these policies, given the positive impact that we see as possible.
Yeah, well, I think that is exactly what we are at the heart of what we are doing with the Putting Assets to Work incubator, is answering that question: is why isn't this stuff done in the US? It happens is, as Tom walked us through, you see it, it's probably pretty common in Europe and Asia, where they have a sovereign wealth fund that manages assets, that generates a return on those assets, and those assets are that return is invested back into the community. I think part of it is just the governance structure in the US is a little less friendly to it. We have, decision making is divided across city, state, county, federal, school districts, transit authorities, Department of Transportation. So the decision making power is not all held in one place. So it's more difficult to have a single entity that moves and executes on this. Nevertheless, I think there's incredible opportunity. I used to teach, before I went into politics, I taught at the law school a class on securities law and securities regulation. I'd always tell a joke that there are two economists walking down the street, and one of them looks ahead and points ahead and leans over to the other and says, look up there, is that a $50 bill lying on the ground up there? And the other one replies and says, no, idiot, it's not a $50 bill. If it was, somebody would have picked it up already. So that's kind of the heart of what we're talking about here, is why hasn't anyone done it? So I think it happens. It's not uncommon to see a jurisdiction that will do a long-term land lease and collect some revenue off of specific assets. What we're trying to model is to take that to scale. I will point to an example where it does happen in government, and it happens pretty commonly with our pension funds. So we're not talking about land per se, but we're talking about dollars that come out of an employee paycheck and is managed to create a return to pay for that employee's future retirement. They're highly regulated, supervised. We see the returns that come from those pension funds, and you have professional managers who work to invest those back into communities. So I think we need a model that is different than just relying on overworked, underpaid government employees to, in addition to the work they're doing, to also be real estate managers. And that's what we're focusing on, and the recommendations we're going to be coming out with soon from our Putting Assets to Work incubator is a model that taps into the expertise of government, but has either a nonprofit partner and private sector partners that attract private capital to invest in these public assets and generate the return back to the community.
Great, thank you, Ben.
I see somebody mentioning the fund of pension funds too. I don't want to neglect to mention that it's not a perfect model. So in the chat. Thanks, John.
Yeah, and maybe Josh, just continuing on what you were discussing, you were focusing on Pennsylvania. I'm just wondering, given your experience and several of the cities there on the land value return, do you find differences in terms of receptivity, maybe just level of knowledge and to some of the policies in different states outside of Pennsylvania?
Yeah, I would say that since Virginia decided this was something that the cities there wanted to pursue, 5 cities have the local option, if you will, to enact land value return. In Virginia, they're jumping all over it. They've been doing some studies. They've hired a city economist in Richmond. And I think the reason for that is that there is more of a devotion to government as a calling, as opposed to a lot of other cities where people just sort of stumble into it. And so they study government, they study the evidence, they look at numbers, and they say, wow, this works. And in a city like Richmond, which has a huge amount of abandoned vacant lots, which should not be, it's in the middle of the I-95 megalopolis. So Richmond asks, why is it like this? And that's why they're considering this alternative right now. And in Pennsylvania, a lot of the people that I've worked with, they've been the sons and grandsons of previous mayors. These are little hermit kingdoms, if you will. And I'm not disparaging them, but this is all they know. They rarely get out of Altoona and go to Pittsburgh. So they're little world, they're pretty happy. It doesn't matter if they don't really see the failures, and they don't see how people are leaving. In Pennsylvania cities, a lot of them left. So bringing people back and ensuring that you can have business operate without abatements and subsidies, I think helps. But people just saying, oh, my Uncle Charlie pays $500 more a year. That's a powerful way to get a good idea stopped. And that's why Telosa is such an exciting concept in my mind's eye. I mean, I always go back to, if I may, I'm going to leave the United States. I always go back to Canberra in Australia, and a very good city planner, Walter Burley Griffin, sketched out the idea of Canberra, and they said, well, how are we going to pay for this? And he said, you know what, with all this stuff we're putting in here, all this infrastructure, I think we'll have enough money to fund the city. And lo, it was so. And Canberra is still very active in this. They have lots of other lousy taxes, and Telosa is going to go it alone, because I suppose everybody agrees now that economic rent from land is probably the way to go. But the human psychology of not wanting to take a chance is, I think, the most active thing. So starting a new city makes all the sense in the world.
Yeah, and there's actually, if I could just build on a theme that both Ben and Josh mentioned, and I think is very important, and that is having government as an active partner in helping to create things. It's sort of a sport in the US to vilify government and make fun of government, but the cities that we have seen around the US and around the world that have been really successful have had governments that were not overweening, but governments that were active, innovative partners in helping individuals and businesses and the community grow and develop. And so I think, the way that we think about government, especially in Telosa, is going to be very active and innovative and a partner with the community, with individuals, with businesses, and of course, with the foundation reinvesting back into the community as well.
And I should stop with that for me, is that in Philadelphia down to Altoona, everybody said this is a great theory, but we're not going to restart our tax system. And of course, a lot of people say, well, why can't we start over the tax system? And the chief valuers and assessors of Philadelphia said, well, I think it's a great idea, but hey, I've got 100 years of other practice behind me. So it's just overcoming that and showing people the possibilities that are inherent in land value return.
There's a question from our community from Alex. What factors can interrupt the equitism virtuous cycle, recession or other factors? And I wonder maybe just to broaden that a little bit, to apply, Ben, to yourself and to Josh, since you're dealing with real cities today. How does your effort in terms of trying to advocate and advance certain policies work in a economic cycle, that has both sort of growth and periods of slower growth? And I wonder, how do you position in during the long cycle? I think, Tom, from your perspective, then perhaps the importance of a long-term approach as well. So maybe just how do we approach it that the economic cycle changes, and sometimes perhaps it can be more challenging to advance policies.
Sure. I mean, the biggest threat to the virtuous cycle is just the city not being successful itself. And so if we're not able to deliver on the things that we are planning to deliver on, then the city won't grow and the land values won't increase, and there'll be no resources. So it's really important to focus in on delivering on what we aim to do. And I believe that the plans that we have are pretty compelling. And there's already been a lot of excitement about it in various areas and communities. And I think just the community itself, as it grows and builds, is going to have a really strong base for people who want to move to Telosa and be part of that community. Because it's a unique situation where you have both the individual qualities for success and the belief in the cohesive community and the reinvestment back into the community combined in one place. And I think that's something that makes it very unique and will really drive that virtuous cycle.
Yeah.
And Josh, maybe as I was mentioning, how difficult is it, during slower economic times, or maybe perhaps cities are more receptive to new ideas and innovations?
You hit the nail on the head. When times are bad, cities will look at alternatives, and they'll start exploring alternatives. Land banks, county land banks and city land banks are a great example of not just reacting, but taking a strategic goal and putting it into place, getting all these vacant lots out of use or off the tax rolls, combining them, putting them on the market. And I would say a down market actually helps the idea of reform. And by market, I mean the global markets, and not just the stock markets, but global conditions. And if you have a good, steady system of revenue coming in that's independent of the global system, I think you're making yourself stronger in the long run and poised for success when times change.
I was thinking, I think certainly there are challenges. Some of the cities that we're working with in this incubator, some of them are high growth cities. Others are cities that aren't, that are struggling. And so certainly that's some of the challenges that we are working with. I think the point is well taken that some of these cities that are struggling may be more hungry, more eager to innovate. And so there's opportunity with all of them. But I was thinking more about another cycle that we're looking at, and that is, so municipal finance, it varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but is largely focused on sales tax. Sales tax is being completely disrupted as sales are moving more increasingly away from retail establishments and more online. So you're seeing that model is disrupted. The property tax model, as you're seeing property being used differently as people are, the question about what happens with commercial spaces, if people are telecommuting or working from home and they're using their home spaces in different ways. So the future of municipal finance is uncertain. And that's why this incubator initiative we're working on resides within the GFOA's Rethinking Revenue Initiative, where we're looking at the storm clouds on the horizon, that we can't continue with the same model of local government finance that we've had for the last 50 years. We have to have a new model. So shifting towards the use of land and creating revenue that can be reinvested back in the community through smarter use of land, not only putting this land on the tax rolls, but doing something with the land that creates activity, that creates revenue that can be invested back into park maintenance and our roads and our education system, and creating opportunities for our residents is important.
Yeah,
something.
About it. I'm
Go
sorry.
ahead, Josh. Sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, during COVID-19, there was a repetition of the Great Recession. There was a repetition of the 1992 recession. Which revenues go first? And the revenues that go first are income taxes, local or state income taxes, and then sales taxes. People can't buy anymore. And then finally, the property tax is the last to see a diminution, if you will, of effect. And during COVID-19, Boston ended up with a surplus, and Philadelphia, my city, was hammered hard by COVID because all of those transactional taxes, sales taxes and business taxes, suffered immeasurably.
Yeah, one thing that what Ben and Josh were both saying that comes to mind is Pittsburgh. So not just Allentown, but Pittsburgh was the poster child for the Rust Belt decline in the late 70s and early 80s. And they had a land value tax and were able to not only redevelop their downtown and keep it active and vibrant, but by the late 80s, they'd gone from early 80s, they had unemployment that was Depression era level unemployment. And by the late 1980s, they were voted as one of the most livable cities in America. So these policies do have a real impact on real lives.
Mm-hmm.
Great. One, Tom, practical question that Keith raised, whether commercial buildings will have the same ownership model as residential buildings.
Sure. Commercial, the buildings are going to be developed by outside contractors through open, transparent bidding. So commercial and residential buildings will be built very similarly to the way that they're built in every city.
And the
Except they
difference
won't
being the land ownership.
Right. They won't own the land.
Okay. Since we're getting close to the top of the hour, there are a number of great questions that what we'll plan to do is leave those to respond in the Telosa Community Network. So we'll take these questions and we will respond to them. Others may require sort of conversation, I think be appropriate, whether Frederick, Michael, Jeff, and Scott. I sort of want to thank you for the information you shared and some of your ideas in the chat. Perhaps the last question for each of our panelists. How can all of us help you? Whether Tom, maybe you can sort of speak to it from our perspective on Telosa in terms of how everyone can be helpful to advance what we're doing for Telosa, and then Ben and Josh, if you can sort of speak to how we can all help you and what you're doing in terms of advancing ideas and policies that contribute to higher quality of life and economic activity in our cities today. So Ben, Ben, you could start?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I kind of mentioned this at the beginning, but it is so exciting to see the work that Telosa is doing, envisioning a new city. If we could start from a blank slate, what would a city look like? And I think, first of all, what you're doing is you're learning from cities that have existed, and the research that's coming out of this initiative, and Tom has presented some of that today, is so fascinating. But your generosity and willingness to not only cull from the learnings of cities over millennia, but also to give back and to say, how can these principles, how can what we've learned from cities across the globe benefit cities right here in America today, but also the work that Telosa is doing, how can that research and knowledge be shared to lift up existing communities across this country? And that's what we're doing, right? That's what we're doing now is sharing information, collaborating on the work we're doing with Telosa, but taking that knowledge and learning that we have and bringing it back to cities to create better communities for all of us.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ben. And we're certainly very excited to be a part in supporting sort of the initiative with yourself and the partners that you've brought in, and the impact this will be having across a number of cities today. So we're excited about that. Josh, maybe the same question in terms of how we can all help you in your efforts.
I think that Telosa can serve as sort of a model, not sort of a model, but an inspiration. The big deficit, I think, in government and people and so on is imagination. And this is very imaginative, but it's positive, it's inclusive, it wants everybody to be a part of it. And a lot of cities used to be like that, certainly in the United States. And this is sort of a go back to the future. And I think that by, with good publicity and good communication to the outside, you're going to achieve that with Telosa.
Great. Well, thanks, Josh. We look forward to continuing to work closely with you and applaud all your efforts. Tom, you want to maybe share an ask from the community and how we can best
Sure.
work together?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is, this was a very high level presentation. So there's a lot more research and there's a lot more depth and substance to every single point that we made today. Lots more examples, lots more white papers and other discussions that we're having on the Mighty Network. So if everyone can please join the Mighty Networks and join us in this conversation, because we're trying to find the most effective way to create this sustainable, inclusive, and really exciting society. And we need everyone's help to do that and build that momentum, because the suggestions that we get from people add to our knowledge and understanding of the world. And as we bring other experts in and continue to grow that, we're planning to really take this to the next level. And I think we can really create a higher quality of life for everyone and create a tremendous society and a new city.
Great. Well, let me use that as an opportunity to close. I want to thank our expert panelists and all of you for joining today. Your feedback is really critical as we work to advance these big ideas. Hope you found the topic of interest and learned something important. As mentioned, if you ask, we ask that you take a moment to complete a brief survey that we've included in the chat. Also, you'll see on the screen, we do have a QR code and link so that you can join the community network. It's important since we want to keep you informed of our future events, which Dr. Daniels spoke about, and we'd love to have you participate. And it's a way to engage. As mentioned, we'll be responding to the questions we didn't have time for in this Telosa Community Network. The next webinar is currently scheduled for October 27th. The topic will be sustainability in the environment. Please plan to tune in. And in the meantime, we look forward to continuing the dialogue with you and want to thank you. And maybe with that, we'll end the recording. Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone.